Good morning and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum live from St. Louis, Missouri. Happy to have you all with us here today. We have a great panel of folks who've been going to meetings, running meetings, getting new ideas, and they wanted to share some of what's going on here with all of you out there. So without further ado, I am going to pass the microphone off to our first participant so that you can meet her.
I'm Beth Stives. I'm with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission.
This is Kim Penn. I'm with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management.
I'm Jason Vogel with App Associates.
And hi, this is Sasha Peterson with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals.
And I'm Laura Hansen from EcoAdapt and the National Adaptation Forum. This is part of a quarterly webinar series that we do to make sure that the messages and ideas that emerge from the National Adaptation Forum don't just happen once every 2 years. So you who are listening from afar have not had the great fun of being here in St. Louis this week, but we wanted to make sure that everyone got to learn some of what was going on here. So I'm going to open the floor up to the participants, to the microphone rather, and have people share what are some of the big exciting things that they've heard over the course of the week. Maybe things that they've never thought about before, people they've never met before, or ideas that they've long held and hoped that someone else cared about too. Sasha, you want to start off?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Mike. One of the things that struck me just from a big picture over the last few days is how many integrated sessions there were. So I went to a number of sessions where there were panelists from a lot of different geographies or a lot of different sectors. So I think it's really neat to see that coming together because frequently you'll get a perspective from a panel that's just municipalities talking about what they're doing. But here at the forum, I've seen panels where it had a municipality, but then also a private sector organization or a nonprofit and talking about seeing how they're approaching their adaptation and building resilience from multiple angles and having that conversation happen at the same time in a single session. I think it's been really
cool. That's an excellent question. I think there's so many ways to respond to it, but one thing that really stands out to me, I think, I'm thinking of the first National Adaptation Forum 2 years ago and what I've seen over the last few days. And it just strikes me that there's a tremendous amount of progress. There's actually a lot of, there's more people here talking about different kinds of things, and new issues that have arisen in that time. And it's been a very organic experience. You know, we've all come in here and started tackling our own little narrow issue that we meet all these other people, and our minds expand a little bit. So one issue that's come up repeatedly at this meeting, and I took some time to make sure I understood it better, is issues of social equity, which I feel, I don't think I personally was spending as much time on that issue as it merited. And it was a really valuable experience for me to be able to see how other people are trying to tackle that issue and the work that they're doing. It's just a much more sophisticated conversation, I think, than we were having 2 years ago.
I'm sorry to jump in, but the other thing I saw is that the equity piece is coming in more at the beginning of the conversation. A lot of these, I feel like 2 years ago, it was sort of like, oh, we should be talking about this issue, but now I've heard it brought up as a central organizing principle for some of the projects that I've done.
Right, so this is Kim Penn. I would have to agree with both of those. I have really enjoyed this time around that more of the sessions that I've gone to are past the planning and are really talking about lessons learned with implementation and the importance of bringing in a number of the partners at the table. I think, like what Sasha said, there are a lot of different folks in the room. They might be talking about an environmental issue and thinking about adaptation and resilience of natural communities, but you had DOT in the room, and you had some of the other planners in the room, and the hazard mitigation community, which is, I think, a great strength of this conference. And I think that we have a lot of folks from those different sectors here this year that has been really great.
And this is Beth Stives. One thing I've found very appealing has been seeing a lot of new tools and resources and seeing not just what they are, but how they've been applied and seeing that planning into actually implementation and application of the tools and the lessons learned and seeing some of the same things we've been working on and struggling with and having successes with used by other folks. it's made me a little more comfortable that we're on the right track to see other people using some of the same resources and tools in the same way and struggling with some of the same struggles we've had, and it wasn't just us. So that's sort of comforting to see this larger community tracking down that same path that we are and having similar experiences, but then there's also been some new experiences that I can take back and use some different options that other people have tried and had successes with.
Excellent. There's a lot of, this is a much bigger event than it was in 2013. Jason already touched on the fact that there's a lot more conversation about equity issues, social cohesion, and more community engagement, and thinking about how to bring in the most diverse community possible. Are there other things that people are identifying as emerging issues that they haven't seen, that they didn't see in 2013 or they have never seen before?
I think the issue that was just brought about, because this is Jason again, by the way, that there is a lot more discussion of implementation. I felt like 2 years ago, there was a lot of conversation about the relevance of science, doing vulnerability assessments, really those early stages, really planning. Who's creating an adaptation plan. And I have seen a lot more here. I went to a couple of sessions, one about what states are doing, that I was just incredibly impressed by what some of these states have accomplished in a very short period of time. And some of it was probably in the works 2 years ago, they just maybe weren't here. But now they know about this meeting, they're coming here, they're sharing that knowledge, and people are actually getting stuff done, which I think is really cool.
I want to welcome, we have another late joiner of our panel. John, can you introduce yourself quickly and then share something that you've seen at the forum that you had not seen before or was particularly interesting to you?
Well, I'm John Wiener. I'm at the University of Colorado, and I'm late because we just had a festival of technical difficulties in a session that ended at 12:30. But I have a few things I very much would like to say. And the first is that this is the beginning. I think one of the things that's most interesting about this meeting is we're all really at the beginning. Everyone here has been probably almost sleepless and has captured about 15% of what has been going on. It is so rich and so much and such an enormous amount of content. It's literally the beginning of the archives available. We're having the excitement of seeing each other live, but it doesn't stop. This really will go on, I think. It is, I believe, a mirror moment. The last one I saw was the Iraq War avoidance protest before the invasion. 1 million people on the Mall of Washington, D.C., realizing that they were not alone. We had a similar one on Earth Day in 1970. Adaptation is having a mirror moment. This is not an oddball, left-wing, strange conspiracy. This is the mainstream of people thinking about the future, thinking that their children are worth something, that their grandchildren are worth. This is a new set of stories that we have to tell ourselves. This is what we need to think about. And I'm absolutely amazed at one thing that comes through every session that I've been to. Every discussion has had an enormous emphasis on the connections between people. The whole fantasy of rugged individualism, and people out there on the frontier all by themselves and make it or break it and be the best you can and forget everybody else, is being eroded by reality back to the fact that we're a group species. People are starting to make connections, and everybody is talking hard and seriously about how to do it. I think that is a theme that has emerged every time I've heard a talk on almost every subject. This is a remarkable transformation from the focus on the technological, what can we do, to a focus on how do we get ourselves to do things we already know are very effective and do work and will help. Thanks for letting me soapbox. I think this is inspiration.
Yeah, John, this is Sasha. I totally agree. Just that sense of the partnerships that it takes in order to respond to the issue of climate change and build resilience. I've seen that brought up not just as a side thing, but as an integral part of all the conversations. And also, I agree that I don't know that I feel like it's the beginning of something, but it is a new chapter in adaptation and preparedness, and having all these people here to start that second chapter or that next wave, I think it's been enlightening and also inspirational.
And this is Beth. To follow up on, it was just almost a side note from John, but he mentioned, getting to see people face to face. And I found that a tremendous benefit. I've been on multiple conference calls or seen webinar presentations by a lot of folks. I see their name, I recognize them, I get to sit down and have in-person conversations. And it's probably sort of a typical thing for all the folks in video webinar land to hear, because you're out there, but I would strongly suggest if these events come in person. It's been a great event to sit down and talk to people and forge those bonds. Now I have faces and made connections with people that otherwise were just a voice, like sort of what we are right now.
I think that's right. I think both the partnership and the inspiration are two themes or two threads that I've seen throughout the last couple of days. It's been really fun to learn from each other and then sort of move forward together now that we have these names and these faces and these partnerships and relationships we're building. I sometimes Sunday school at our church. Anyhow, one of the ways that you do it, you talk about wondering together. And so you tell stories to each other and then you wonder. And I wonder what would happen if we did this. I wonder what would happen if you made these partnerships or you moved in this direction or used this new information. And I feel like that's a cool thing that we've been able to do together here.
A face-to-face issue, this is John again, is really one of the more perplexing problems. We're talking about reducing climate impacts and reducing the use of fossil fuels. I think one of the great dilemmas is how to balance the fact that it is wonderful to be in the same place at the same time. It is great to have that facial sense because humans communicate so many ways that are nonverbal. But on the other hand, it costs a lot to get to different places. So we are thinking, I think, of more of the regional adaptation meetings that have been discussed, that EcoAdapt is talking about and promoting, that ASAP is working hard on. So I think we are looking at the balance question. And if we can make those connections when we need to, then we can go forward using the technology and using more local connections. The local activities are really the other theme that's come out for me watching the sessions. Tremendous amount of activity by people starting literally at the block level, at the census tract level, at the city level, working upwards and outwards from there. So this is a widespread issue at every scientific meeting. It's how many of these should we do? How often should we travel? But now we have faces, and I think with the video technology that's coming on, we'll get a little bit of progress.
And the challenge here is that the adaptation community is beyond just the scientific community. I mean, it's the scientific community, it's the governmental community, it's the community. It is this as holistic and broad a community of practice as possible, which makes figuring out how to convene it and how often to convene it and what manner to convene it really difficult or challenging.
This meeting ended up with 20% academics, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds right. A little high on academics.
Well, a lot of the people who identify themselves as academics, though, come from extension agencies. So Sea Grant folks will identify themselves as, when they fill out their form, will appear as an academic entity because they're placed in an academic institution. The same with USDA extension folks. yeah, we have to do the sub-analysis of the analysis. So those of you who are listening to this, if you have questions, please enter them through the questions or the chat section, and we can relay them to the panelists. And you can find out more about specific things that are going on. But I'm interested to hear more from the panelists just about, was there something quirky that you found that you thought, wow, this is something I wasn't even thinking about? I went to a session on art and storytelling and adaptation, which was really interesting. There's someone who makes turning story cylinders that you put your own thoughts inside of, and they get read at the end, so people are expressing their own feelings while reflecting on the artist's thoughts on the process. Anything else people experienced along those more whimsical lines?
I have to say I loved the poem in the opening session. I liked the way that the town hall went with the opening session and having the diversity of perspectives that we heard. And one of them was this poem, and I don't know how many of you guys were there to hear it, but she got up and told a story through a poem, and it was a little bit about her daughter, I think. And I just thought it was really inspirational and a great way to start it off.
I thought you were going to repeat it for us.
I wish.
Right here.
I pictured in the bathroom, and I asked her if she could send it out, because I thought it would be anything to capture.
She could tweet it in like 15 tweets.
That's long. But she did, one of her, I feel like, messages was that you have to start somewhere, right? Do something. You don't have to do everything, do something. And I felt like that also was something I heard in a number of, whether it be a really scientific session that I went to, or a slightly more inspirational one. I think that thread came out that we can't look at it. And that's how it's been with climate, right? Like, you can't look at it at that big picture and become overwhelmed. You have to start somewhere and take that first step.
This is Beth. I had one of the sessions yesterday. This wasn't whimsical, but it was somewhat emotional for one of the participants in the session. There was some discussions about, the validity of people, beliefs that there's climate change happening and the causes. And this one particular lady who spoke up was from Alaska, and she's living the changes. She stated that her husband had called her just that morning and said, we have to move the house. There's inches of water coming in. And she mentioned her sister's house had 20-something inches of water, and how this affects their food supply. She said whenever she comes to the States, she gets sick because they primarily eat caribou and fish, and she's here eating all our processed foods, and how linked their primary food supplies are to climate. And they've seen a over 50% reduction in the caribou herd they depend on because it was too warm during calving season, and the insects, I guess it was flies, she didn't elaborate, but reduced their herd due to calf mortality 2 years ago. And so I think she struggled with her emotions saying this, because she was sitting in this room where people are saying, there's still people who don't believe it, and she's living this day to day. So I didn't really expect to have that on that personal level connection come out. So it was very strong comment she had made.
Yeah. John, there's a question that I think you should answer. Mara Omega asks, one criticism from the early efforts was a lack of agriculturally focused attendees in 2013. Did that turn around in St. Louis? Did you plant this question?
I did not plant this question, but I have been lobbying since 2013 for more ag, and I'm absolutely delighted that we had a sequence worked out rather nicely, and on Wednesday afternoon, a session called The Roots of Adaptation. I don't remember if it was number 48 in the final listings, but that panel had absolutely top of the line people talking about U.S. policy issues now from the Department of Agriculture, from some of the leading researchers in the world. USDA is directed by Congress, but within USDA, there are people doing their very best in brilliant careers to provide extraordinary progress. And many of them were here and put on a terrific program. Then this morning, two of the leading scientists working on the impacts of ag policy in the world soil erosion crisis, which is as bad a part of the problems we have as any other part. It is on a par with ocean acidification, the fundamental disabling of life support systems. Two of those folks were in a session with a woman doing terrific things with Kansas farmers to counter that. What can they do in Kansas? That session was on progress in water, energy, and soils. And then we had a transformational change in agriculture session. And that had some technical difficulties, but the PDF will work beautifully, for sure. And the next session at 1:30 involves rural and urban linkages. And the deep frustration about the ag sessions for the ag people was how much overlap of timing there was, because this is such a rich event, with the fact that we all wanted to also go to the tribal track, which has been enormous in terms of the moving experiences. The sense of place that those people bring is powerful. It's powerful for everyone, whether they are from that place, but just to feel in themselves the memories of where they care about, where they grew up. We all have a root someplace, possibly a little smaller if we've been forced to move around a lot, but everyone's got some space or place, or as Nichols says in a beautiful book called Blue Mind, we all have a water that is our favorite sacred water, that is our special thing, even if it's just a water fountain in a hallway. We all have a root somewhere in the water, and we all have a root somewhere in a place. The Native Americans have brought that to our attention enormously powerfully. The outpouring of pain and efforts to find solutions from the tribal track is incredibly powerful. I hope people will very much access those things and not feel that they're limited to Indian country issues. This is everybody. Those folks are from everywhere.
And that, I mean, that has been a very successful track throughout the National Adaptation Forum. In 2013, the tribes actually came to the forum very quickly and said that they wanted to have a big presence so that they could converse within tribes, between tribes, and beyond tribes. And this year we did more to try and integrate the tribal sessions throughout the program so that it was easier to get to them. But it is a very rich program. For those of you listening who haven't visited the program on the website for the forum, there are 10 or more concurrent sessions at any given time slot. So you're always missing at least one other thing you'd want to be at. Getting agriculture into the program was a big success story. Is there another topic that should be a target for 2017?
What about private landowners? Working with private land in Florida and Central and South Florida, it's a lot of focus on the natural resource values of these working landscapes, and they may become all the more important in the future as our human demographics shift, particularly flow with sea level rise, and there's these working landscapes may be the future strongholds for natural resource values as well as the working landscape. So I know the Peninsula Florida Landscape Conservation Cooperative, one of its focus areas is working with private landowners. So I don't know that it's not here, but it would be something good to maybe bump up.
Well, to build on that, I mean, extending it to private industry as a whole, I think is a missing piece of the conversation. For all the resources that we can put, for like the public sector can put into this issue in terms of hiring sustainability coordinators or integrating climate change into city planning, there are literally billions and billions of dollars of development happening that may or may not be climate resilient, that may not be taking into consideration some of the things that we're talking about. It's always difficult to make that connection, but it is one that I think we could make some huge inroads, and it's actually already happening. You can see people who are involved in natural hazards mitigation are starting to show up here. Those people work a lot more the insurance industry and with developers. The American Planning Association is a little more involved now, but that connection I think could be a lot stronger.
Yeah, this is Sasha. I'd agree. I think the public sector was probably the lowest rate of participation, with not less than double digits, so like 8 or 9% of the attendees are from the private
A
sector.
tripling from the last event.
Excellent, excellent.
But that includes me, you know,
Yeah,
like I'm a consultant who works for public agencies, so it's not.
The majority
it's
of
not
those
a
are
developer, right? It's, yeah, so I think it's again, subdividing and really targeting the people that we want to bring in. And that could be as simple as just having some crossover with the American Planning Association. I think is a really great opportunity. And I know they have a huge track, or had a huge track in Seattle at their recent conference on, I think they called it climate resilience, that track. More of those people should be at this meeting, more of us should be at that meeting.
I think also the chambers of commerce are another way to get some of those private business folks in the US. They have supported a couple meetings. They're definitely thinking about it. It's their businesses too that are out there and needing to better understand how to take the information in and make their businesses, their place of business, but also their supply chains more resilient. So.
Business continuity after a disaster is essentially, on average, half are dead and not coming back. Half. That's half the business in the community that is gone after that disaster. It will eventually be replaced if the community comes back. But that's half of those business people and those families and those incomes and their expenditures off the menu. And one of the things that we have failed to sell adequately as a message is that it isn't global warming. It's global change, and it's climate variation, and it's climate and weather extremes. But that's starting to penetrate whether we felt it sensitively or not, whether we learned it scientifically or not. People in the ag sessions have universally remarked that farmers are no longer denying. There's no weather deniers, as Bob Goff says. There's climate deniers still, but there's no weather deniers. That link that you mentioned between climate and weather extremes is scientifically absolutely clear. But even if we never say the word climate, adaptation to the present is not completely successful. We need to bring in the rest of the folks whose businesses are at stake, and whose towns are at stake.
We have another question. Jamie Carson wants to know whether or not anyone heard about any interesting partnerships, maybe unique partnerships that are out there. And if you didn't hear about any here, Jamie would like to know if you know of other dynamic examples of partnership that are worth learning from or replicating.
Yeah, this is Jason again. I think we could go on for the rest of the hour on this particular topic, but I just the session I attended this morning was the San Diego Climate Collaborative session, which was concurrent with the Southeast Florida Climate Collaborative session. And one thing that came out there are the collaborations between scientific institutions, local government, foundations, NGOs, and we can very specifically cite exactly which ones are in San Diego, but you can get that information online. But I think that's something that we're actually seeing more and more of. There's a lot of discussion of sort of the resource constrained nature of the work that we're doing here. Collaboration seems to be one of the things that people keep coming back to, and they're very creative about it, who they work with in order to really leverage what would otherwise be a bunch of people spending a tiny amount of time on the issue to really being able to make it a significant effort, such as an entire collaborative in San Diego, including 5 cities, several nonprofits and foundations.
This is Sasha, that trend towards regional resilience initiatives, I think is really promising and has grown a lot since 2013, where maybe Florida was in its kind of beginning phases in 2013, and now there are 5 collaboratives around California. There's emerging collaboratives in the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast, and around the Boston and DC metro region. So that acknowledgement that climate impacts extend beyond jurisdictions and are sometimes best addressed at a regional scale, I think has gained a lot of traction since 2013.
I was just gonna say, but on the partnership thing too, I think I've heard of, there's different types of partnerships depending on where you are in that, on the ladder or in your process. So in the planning and engagement in certain urban areas, you might be partnering with civic organizations or religious organizations. And then for some of the other larger scale sort of initiatives, maybe in the environmental realm where you're doing natural infrastructure, you might be partnering with entities that can provide funding, so private businesses or developers or others. So I've heard of a lot of different ones, and it sort of depends on where you're going, who you need to engage, and what you're looking for. If you're looking for support financially, if you're looking for buying locally.
I have to just add, this is John butting in. We are hearing more and more in all sorts of sessions about what's clumsily referred to as payment for ecosystem services. We're recognizing and valuing the qualities of the world that we in fact do value very, very much. We've heard it all, that people need access to a pleasant place to be, to a pleasant place to go. The Last Child in the Woods book has come up. Blue Mind has come up. The discussions of what are urban interests in rural areas and that urban-rural interface keep coming up in all sorts of places. I think we're beginning to take that larger vision of where we live, what determines quality of life, and to put some money where our hearts really are. We sure hope we don't see an end to that. That's I think the leap that we're starting to make with all these connections. Some of these partnerships involve things like these payments for ecosystem services. The little example that I like to mention is this crummy little system in New York City where they provide a mere 1.4 billion gallons a day with an 80% cost savings by preserving some of the best farmland in the state of New York and some other states in their watershed. With an 80% cost savings, he's mentioning the 80% cost savings by preserving that watershed. The partnerships that are out there that have not yet found each other are absolutely mind-boggling.
Okay, we have another question. Deborah Carlson wants to know who's leading work on implementing or valuing, going back to your ecosystem service valuation, resilient strategies for coastal communities that focus on green infrastructure and coastal habitat protection or restoration, especially on the West Coast.
One starting place, absolutely, highly recommended, is eartheconomics.org. An NGO called eartheconomics.org is devoted to what economists call the correct application of transferable benefits, or benefits transfer. The notion that you don't have to reinvent the wheel with full-scale economic evaluation every time you run across a wetland. A wetland in one place is a little different from a wetland in another place, but we do know something about the values of these things. The numbers are mind-boggling. It's a great website, eartheconomics.org. The whole notion of valuation, however, often arises in subtle ways that are not talked about. But if you look at the Trust for Public Land website, that group provides a measure called conservation vote. They update it after all sorts of elections, off years as well as the billionaire television festival years. And the number of yes votes for conservation, for quality of life, far outweighs the number of no votes, even in fiscally pressed times. The number of times people say, I want that for my kids, I want that for my weekend, I want that for our city, I want that for the town. Overwhelming approval when people get a chance to express themselves.
Kim, how about from NOAA's formerly known as the Coastal Services Center?
Yeah. The first part of that question was
implementing resilient strategies for coastal communities focusing on green infrastructure and coastal habitat protection.
Who is doing it?
Yeah.
Who is funding it? So
Well, I would answer both and maybe provide some sexy examples.
I don't know that I have a sexy example. But I think that you can find, obviously, well, you mentioned the Coastal Services Center, the office formerly known as, part of the office formerly known as the Coastal Services Center, and Digital Coast. So there are resources, of course, online that you can go to at a variety of different scales for a variety of different tools that help to both identify places and plan for natural infrastructure, as well as get information on, I mean, we're starting to get more information on the effectiveness of different green infrastructure approaches. There's also, of course, Coastal Resilience from the Nature Conservancy. There are a ton of different tools online right now. And within organizations, skills and knowledge within organizations that one can tap to better understand where we might place natural infrastructure, how we might choose between different approaches, how we can integrate it with traditional gray approaches that might be the best in certain areas. And then we have a lot of course, federal agencies and other groups that are, that you wouldn't necessarily think about it, the Departments of Transportation. Are really looking at natural infrastructure along the coastal zone. Army Corps of Engineers, of course, is moving forward with their SAGE initiative and engineering with nature. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
That last bit's an indication of the sea change. I think this is Jason. When the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is starting to talk about green infrastructure, like things have changed in a dramatic way. I don't have anything to add specifically on the coast, particularly right in the western, southern area of California or whatever it was, but in a general sense, national infrastructure or green infrastructure has come up in so many different ways at this conference. And at one level, I think it's because that concept has been sort of co-evolving at the same time. The field of adaptation has been growing so dramatically. But green infrastructure was kind of a weird topic as few as 3 or 4 years ago. And the number of people that cited here for very different things. Sometimes it's preservation of coastal wetlands. That's more of a conservation, maybe motivated activity, but it still serves a lot of functions for protecting the communities nearby. And then you have people inland doing similar things when they're thinking about needing to deal with combined sewer overflows. And they're talking about the ways that they are using both gray and green infrastructure now through parks and complete streets, green complete street designs where they're merging multimodal transportation with cool, lowered, like no curbs, all the water goes off the street and infiltrates. It seems like it's almost commonplace. It's something that everyone wants to do. It's been an interesting shift.
Yeah, it has. I mean, during this conference, there have been a number of sessions, so many of you can't get to them all.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the natural resource side of things, sort of as a segue from built environment and communities to green infrastructure to what about natural resources. In 2013, natural resources was a dominant topic in this conversation. It's actually moved into a smaller space now. From my perspective, I look forward to the day when every session covers both built and natural environment in the same breath, because they're necessary in order to get good outcomes. And I think that's part of why the Army Corps is actually starting to embrace this issue, because as they're developing 500-year plans, they're suddenly realizing we don't have the money or the technology to build things that will withstand 500 years. But wow, the natural environment does that just fine. So Beth, do you want to talk at all about what you've seen is going on in that space around species protection and habitat protection?
Sure. Well, the few sessions, like I said, there's been multiple ones that I wanted to get to, couldn't. So this is from a very subset of the sessions. And I have focused on the natural resource ones. I debated on should I expand out and look at some of these other ones, but I really have focused on making sure I'm up to speed with what other folks are doing, some of the latest and greatest things going on out there. And in these natural resource sessions, they have even brought up, we really need to bring in these other partners that, they're calling them new partners, but they're not necessarily new. We've always acknowledged, I think, that we need to work with them, but it's, I think, even more important moving forward to have these discussions and make sure natural resources are brought up at the front of a lot of these discussions with the infrastructure and built environment. Because there's almost this natural resources. I went to the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategies, sort of their session this morning on what's some actionable things that have happened because of that. And these same conversations were coming up in that session in the discussion about making sure we're linked. And when you look at the bigger picture, the strategy has been used in the Presidential Climate Action Plan, and it's been referred to as this sort of cutting edge first document. But then when the bigger picture comes out, natural resources falls below, the economy and healthcare. And so how do we make natural resources stick at the top or be relevant to all those other higher priority issues and not be, oh yeah, there's this other stuff that when we get down through the top 20 really important things we can think about natural resources. So the fact that that National Adaptation Strategy that was targeted toward fish, wildlife, and plants is being held up as sort of the golden star up there, that this is a model to replicate in these other industries, was really exciting to hear about. But as far as natural resources directly, there's a lot of tools. It's almost what's needed now is this guide, not guide to how to do things, but the guide to the tools. For several years ago, there's like 1 or 2 or 3, and it was great. We have these tools, and now there's a suite of tools, and we almost need guidance on well, which one applies best. And people are starting to think about that, which will be really useful to not just grab the one you hear about first, but there some guidance on don't do this because your neighbor did it, or someone else in your agency or a partner agency used it and said this is great, but how to decide what tool or what process is the best for what your goal is. And a lot of that is identifying what is your real goal. So there's been a lot of really good discussions on that. So it's not necessarily information overload, but it's getting to where there's going to be some decisions to make of how to be most effective with a lot of this new information and new tools and resources.
If I could jump in on that topic, this is Jason again. It was just a session I happened to go to. It was interesting. I think it's relevant to this topic. One of the big buzz topics right now in this community is metrics and monitoring and evaluation. You can count me amongst the skeptics of how good we're going to end up doing that, but I wanted to learn more. So I went to this session, and it was a gentleman from the Nature Conservancy talking about a data set that they had developed as a way to measure the value of land as habitat into the future. So despite, how can you figure out, and for them it's the Nature Conservancy, they wanted to know what's the value of the land that they have in their portfolio that they might consider acquiring as climate changes. And so they came up with a really interesting way of trying to measure the ability of that land to adapt and maintain diversity of species. And it looked at 2 major factors. One was the diversity of habitat types within a small-ish area, for them small, 100 acres. So it's really looking for areas with different aspects, different types of habitats, wetlands and dry areas, lots of microclimates basically, under the assumption that lots of microclimates will allow species to more easily survive. And then a second metric, which was the connectedness of that plot of 100 acres with other plots of 100 acres. They developed a map of the entire eastern seaboard all the way almost to the Mississippi, where they did this for the entire United States, well, that half the United States. And I was sort of blown away because, all these people are talking about metrics and whether it will or not be useful. The Nature Conservancy is really taking a lead role in creating a metric that they're using themselves, but then they put it out there. They open sourced it. And local communities have started using it to make decisions about the kinds of activities they want to undertake in their own areas. I think there were stories of people in Vermont looking at conservation easements and using that data set to decide where they wanted those conservation easements to be so that they were valuable not just today, but under a changing climate and into the future.
I thought I was at that session as well, and I thought one of the neat things too was that how they use that information for their how they were thinking to use that information for their management. So then they, I think this was the same, they parsed out to the percentage of their lands that fit into the different categories. And so much of the land that they had already purchased, they would do active management on because they saw it as it would be very resilient, or they would take the time to make sure that that stayed in their portfolio. And then there was this small percent that did not come up high in this metric.
Yeah.
And it was like, we're not going to use as much funding for this because the chances are, even if we do very strong management on it and restoration, it's not actually going to be conducive to strong biodiversity in the future. So that.
Okay, so we're nearing the end of our webinar, but I want to let each one of you do what we'll be doing in the town hall this afternoon. Those of you who are listening remotely, the town hall closing plenary will also be broadcast live. If you go into the chat section of the webinar, you can find the link. Will also be the opportunity again for you to submit tweets that will be shared with everyone in the room. But I would like each of you to share a thought about what is something that you are taking home from the National Adaptation Forum that you will be applying to your work going forward. And we're going to start at the other end this time, Beth.
All right, so we have a new project we're about to launch in July, working with our local land managers, our state folks, but bringing in our partner agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state parklands to bring planning to action. And so we have sort of a process outlined, but I've seen several other projects that have done a similar thing and used slightly different methods. So I've jotted down some notes, and maybe this is a good plug. I'm hoping the PowerPoints will all be available online after the conference is over.
That is our ambition.
So I'm hoping to be able to grab those because I couldn't take notes quite fast enough. But I do have some, I think there's some good information there that can help us format our process for this project that we have coming up starting in just a couple months.
I guess I would say, there's a lot, it's hard to kind of pick something, both at the professional and the personal level. So I guess I would say one of the things that I saw the most, was one of the most meaningful things was just the value of the partnerships and new partnerships and reaching out to people who might not be traditional partners in some of our initiatives. And so I think that that's where I had a couple folks from agencies and organizations that I haven't worked with in the past that I would make connections with to move forward some of our NOAA initiatives in the coastal zone forward in the future.
So one of the things, this is Sasha, that I'm going to take back is just the importance of the storytelling piece and focusing on some success. I feel like we get steeped in the vulnerability assessment and the climate impacts and the analysis, but I feel like one thing this conference does for me each time I come is highlights, the progress that we're making. And with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, we had a prize for progress that we gave out at the beginning of this conference and had 4 amazing finalists, and just highlighting those shining examples of things that are happening to move the field forward and kind of internalizing that and feeling reinvigorated, and then taking that out into the work that I do to tell those stories to let people know it's not all doom and gloom. Yes, there are going to be a lot of changes, but there are paths forward with that. It's something I'm going to take away.
John, here, I'd like to say that I'm going to take away what we used to call bumper stickers as a non-car person. I don't want a bumper sticker unless it fits on my bicycle, but I might have a backpack sticker or a guitar case sticker. Defending the valuable and the vulnerable is the new short slogan. But what's really, I think, coming clear here is that we are in danger of underplaying the natural environment issues because they've made so much progress and because they have gotten into all the discourse. We can't let them sink into the discourse and become invisible. But they are part of it. Everyone's thinking in a way that they weren't 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We're really on the process here of growing and changing the pie. that's making partnerships a whole new enterprise and a whole new set of opportunities, because we're not just fighting over the size of the slice and who gets which one. This is a truly inspirational event. Thank you for doing it. You go ahead, Lara.
Thank you all for coming. Jason?
Yeah, Jason Vogel here. The thing I think I'll take away and actually integrate it to the work I do is the social justice and equity piece, where I've been chiding people to ask the climate question for all 8 years that I've been a consultant in this field, and for several years before that as a student. And I think I was not really asking the equity question in the work that I did. It just didn't occur to me that that was something I needed to think about and tackle. And I was a little skeptical at first of whether I could do that. And I think based on what I've learned at the meetings here, I think it's actually pretty easy. It's as easy as convincing people to ask that climate question. So that's something when I go back to App Associates and continue the work that we do there, I'm going to start integrating that into the way that I interact with our clients and the kinds of work we do for them and the suggestions we make, and just make sure that we're not doing any harm, at least, and possibly helping empower people and solve problems beyond just the climate problem in the process.
Just the climate problem. Well, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for taking time out of the forum. As at least two of the panelists mentioned, one of the great values about being here is being here, because you get to have so many rich conversations with so many people who are thinking about the same kinds of things you are, but with a different perspective, allowing you to innovate new things and move your own work along while hopefully contributing to theirs a little bit as well. So please stay tuned for this afternoon's closing plenary. Please stay tuned on CAKE, the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, for hopefully more content from the National Adaptation Forum, including PDFs of posters and of presentations. Cruise around in the program, identify people whose work looked interesting, and contact them in the real world. So thank you all. This webinar was recorded, and you can listen to it again at your leisure. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lara.